Imagine, as the world grows quiet and you sink into calm, that high above the ancient earth rises a shining palace. On Mount Olympus, marble halls glow in twilight and secrets linger on every breeze. Here, among gods and goddesses older than memory, stands one whose wisdom is said to pierce the night itself. Tonight, as you find your breath and let your thoughts drift, we'll journey with Athena, the grey-eyed goddess whose birth was so strange and powerful it shook the heavens. But how was Athena truly born, and why did her arrival terrify the gods? What secret did her mother whisper to Zeus, a secret so dangerous it was hidden for all time? Why did Athena choose a life untouched by love, and how did such a choice shape the fate of heroes and cities? Let these questions gently stir your imagination as you rest under the watchful eyes of a goddess whose wisdom could change destiny itself. If these stories truly help you relax, feel free to leave a gentle like. If you'd like, you're welcome to share in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you now. Tonight, you're among fellow dreamers, all under the quiet protection of Athena's wisdom. Long before Athena's legendary wisdom would guide heroes through their greatest challenges, there lived a titaness named Meti, whose name itself meant wisdom and cunning counsel. She was beautiful beyond mortal comprehension, with eyes that held the depth of all knowledge and a mind sharper than any blade ever forged. When the great war between the Titans and the new generation of gods raged across the heavens, it was Metis who helped Zeus, young and ambitious, to free his siblings from their father Cronus' stomach. It was her clever strategy that turned the tide of battle, her whispered advice that helped Zeus claim the throne of the cosmos. As the dust of that cosmic war settled, and Zeus established his reign from the cloud-wreathed peaks of Olympus, he found himself drawn to this wise and beautiful titaness. Their courtship was brief but passionate, and soon Metis became Zeus's first wife, dwelling beside him in the halls of power where lightning crackled and thunder rolled with his every breath. But the gods, for all their might and majesty, are not immune to fear, especially the fear that haunts all rulers, the fear of being overthrown. One day, as Zeus sat upon his throne of gold and storm clouds, the ancient prophecy reached his ears like whispers carried on the wind. Gaia, the Earth Mother herself, and Uranus, the starry sky, spoke words that chilled even the king of the gods to his immortal bones. They told him that Meti would bear 2 children, first a daughter, then a son. The daughter would be equal to Zeus in strength and wisdom, they said, but the son would be greater than his father in power, and would one day overthrow him, just as Zeus had overthrown Cronus, and Cronus had overthrown Uranus before him. The cycle of divine succession, it seemed, was as inevitable as the turning of the seasons. Zeus felt the familiar weight of destiny pressing upon his shoulders, the same inexorable force that had driven his father to swallow his own children in a desperate attempt to avoid his fate. But Zeus was cleverer than Cronus, and far more ruthless when necessity demanded it. If the prophecy spoke truth, then the son must never be born, and the only way to ensure this was to make certain that Metis could never give birth to him. The king of the gods devised a plan as elegant as it was terrible. He approached his beloved wife with gentle words and loving embraces, speaking of games and transformations, as gods sometimes did to amuse themselves in their immortal leisure. "My dearest Meti," he said with a smile that masked his true intentions, "show me your gift for changing shape. Transform yourself into something small and delicate, perhaps a droplet of water, or a wisp of smoke, or even a tiny fly that might dance upon the palm of my hand." Meti, trusting in her husband's love and delighting in his playfulness, laughed with the sound of silver bells chiming in mountain air. She began to shimmer and shift, her divine form condensing and changing until she had become no larger than a common fly, hovering delicately in the space between them. Her wings caught the light like fragments of rainbow, and her tiny form pulsed with the same wisdom that had once filled her goddess body. In that moment, Zeus opened his mouth and swallowed her whole. The deed was done in an instant, quick as lightning and final as death. Metis, the wisest of all beings, found herself trapped within the belly of her husband, her wisdom now becoming part of him, her counsel forever sealed within his mind. Zeus believed he had cheated fate itself, that by consuming the source of the prophecy he had prevented it from ever coming to pass. But what Zeus did not know, what even his divine senses could not detect, was that Metis had already conceived their first child. Deep within his own body, the daughter promised by prophecy was growing, developing, drawing upon the very essence of both parents as she formed in the darkness. Months passed on Olympus as they always do, measured not by mortal time but by the slow dance of stars and the ancient rhythms of cosmic forces. Zeus continued to rule, to thunder across the sky, to shape the destinies of gods and mortals alike, all while carrying within him a secret that he did not even know he bore. And then, one fateful morning, the headaches began. At first, they were merely irritating, a dull throbbing behind his eyes that made the Lord of Lightning wince as he held court. But as days turned to weeks, the pain grew worse, building like a storm gathering strength. It felt as though his skull was being struck by hammers wielded by the Cyclopes themselves, each blow reverberating through his immortal mind with increasing intensity. The pain became so severe that Zeus could barely concentrate on his divine duties. He found himself clutching his head during important meetings, his vision blurring as waves of agony crashed through his consciousness. Even Hera, despite their complicated relationship, grew concerned at seeing her powerful husband reduced to such distress. The other gods watched in growing alarm as their mighty king staggered through the halls of Olympus, his face contorted with pain. Some whispered that perhaps this was divine justice for his treatment of Metis, while others feared that some cosmic catastrophe was about to befall them all. The agony reached its peak on a morning when the sun god Apollo was driving his chariot across the dawn sky, painting the clouds in shades of rose and gold. Zeus collapsed upon his throne, his hands pressed to his temples, and let out a roar of pain so tremendous that it shook the very foundations of Mount Olympus. The sound echoed across the mortal world below, where humans looked up at the clear sky in confusion, wondering at the thunder that came without clouds. Hermes, the swift messenger god, and Hephaestus, the master craftsman, rushed to their father's aid. Zeus, his voice rough with suffering, gasped out his desperate plea. The pain had become unbearable. Something was trying to burst free from inside his skull, and he needed them to split open his head to release whatever was trapped within. Hephaestus, with his strong arms and skilled hands, took up his great bronze axe, the same type of double-headed labrys that had been sacred to the old powers. Without hesitation, for Zeus's agony was terrible to behold, he raised the weapon high and brought it down with divine precision upon the crown of his father's head. The moment the axe touched Zeus's skull, the world held its breath. Even the winds stopped their eternal dance, and the waves upon distant seas grew still as glass. Then, with a crack like the breaking of mountains, Zeus's head split open and light poured forth. Not the red light of blood, but brilliant silver radiance that blazed like captured starlight. From that blazing cleft leaped Athena, fully grown and magnificent beyond all description. She stood as tall as a mortal woman in her prime, but her presence filled the hall like a force of nature. She was dressed in gleaming armor that had been forged within Zeus's mind by her mother Metis, a breastplate of silver that seemed to flow like water, a crested helm that caught the light like polished mirror, and in her hands she held a great spear that hummed with divine power and a shield that bore upon its surface mysteries yet to be revealed. But it was her eyes that truly marked her as something special among the gods, grey eyes like storm clouds heavy with rain that seemed to hold within them all the wisdom of the ages. Those grey eyes surveyed the assembled gods with calm intelligence, taking in every detail of her new existence with the kind of instant understanding that lesser beings might struggle for years to achieve. As Athena drew her first breath as a free being, she raised her spear and struck it upon her shield, producing a sound like thunder rolling across distant hills. The clash of bronze upon bronze rang out over Olympus, announcing to all creation that a new power had been born into the world. Even Helios, the sun god himself, stopped his horses mid-stride to witness this moment, causing day to pause in its eternal journey across the sky. Zeus, his headache instantly vanished with the release of his hidden daughter, looked upon Athena with wonder and immediate, overwhelming love. Here was the child of his own mind and the wisdom of Metis combined, a being who embodied both power and intelligence in perfect balance. From that very first moment, she became his favorite among all his children, the one who would sit closest to his throne and share in his most important decisions. The other gods gasped in amazement as they beheld this new sister, this aunt, this divine being who had emerged not from the usual romantic entanglements that produced most of their kind, but from pure thought and wisdom made manifest. Hera, despite her usual jealousy regarding Zeus's children, found herself oddly pleased, for here was a daughter born without another woman's involvement, a child who belonged solely to the royal family of Olympus. Which of the origin stories of the gods do you find most fascinating? For me, it has to be Athena's birth from Zeus's head. There's something almost modern about the idea that wisdom and strategy can emerge fully formed from pure thought. But let us continue with the tale of this remarkable goddess. From the moment of her dramatic entry into the world, Athena displayed the characteristics that would define her throughout eternity. Unlike some of her siblings who needed time to grow into their powers, she possessed from birth an adult understanding of her nature and her purpose. She was wisdom personified, but not the passive, scholarly sort of wisdom that sits in libraries accumulating dust. No, Athena's wisdom was active and engaged, the kind that solves problems and navigates complex challenges with strategic brilliance. As the days passed and Athena established herself among the Olympian family, it became clear that she was unlike any goddess who had come before. She showed no interest in the romantic entanglements that occupied so much divine attention. When Aphrodite spoke of love and Hera of marriage, Athena listened with polite attention but remained unmoved. She had made a choice, or perhaps the choice had been made for her in the manner of her birth, to remain forever virgin, to dedicate herself entirely to the pursuits of mind and spirit rather than flesh. This was not a cold or bitter choice, but one made with serene certainty. Athena understood that her power came from her independence, her ability to see clearly without the complications that passionate attachments might bring. She was to be the goddess of pure thought, of strategy unclouded by emotion, of wisdom that could guide others precisely because it remained detached from personal desires. Zeus, recognizing the unique nature of his grey-eyed daughter, granted her privileges that he gave to no other child. Most significantly, he allowed her to carry his Aegis, that legendary shield or breastplate that was one of the symbols of his supreme authority. The Aegis was more than mere armor. It was a manifestation of divine protection and power, fringed with golden tassels and bearing at its center the head of the Gorgon Medusa, whose gaze could turn any living thing to stone. When Athena wore the Aegis, she became not just a goddess of wisdom, but wisdom armed and ready to defend what was right and just. The sight of her striding across the battlefield with Zeus's own Aegis upon her breast would send terror into the hearts of those who fought against justice, while filling heroes and righteous warriors with courage that could overcome any odds. But Athena's domains extended far beyond the battlefield, encompassing all the civilized arts that separate mortals from beasts. She was the patron of weavers, who transformed simple threads into complex patterns through patience and skill. She watched over potters as they shaped clay into vessels both beautiful and useful. Metalworkers called upon her blessing as they forged tools and weapons that would serve mankind for generations. In the great city that would eventually bear her name, Athena found her most devoted worshippers. But that story, the tale of how Athens came to be named for the grey-eyed goddess, deserves its own moment in our journey through her mythology. Long before Athens was the glorious city-state we remember from history, it was a small settlement ruled by King Cecrops, a wise ruler who was said to be half man and half serpent, symbolizing the connection between earthly wisdom and divine knowledge. This little community had grown and prospered under his leadership, and word of its potential had reached the heights of Olympus, where two great gods began to take special interest in its future. Both Athena and her uncle Poseidon, the mighty god of the seas, looked upon this mortal city and decided that they wished to become its patron deity. Each recognized that this settlement had the potential to become something truly great, a center of learning and culture that would influence the world for centuries to come. But there could be only one patron, only one god who would guide the city's destiny and receive its primary devotion. Zeus, wise in the ways of preventing conflicts among his divine family, proposed a contest. Each god would offer the city a gift, and the mortal inhabitants would choose which gift was more valuable. Whichever deity provided the better gift would become the city's patron and protector, while the other would accept defeat gracefully and without resentment. The day of the contest dawned bright and clear, with gentle winds carrying the scent of wild herbs from the surrounding hills. The entire population of the city gathered in what would one day become the Acropolis, that sacred height where temples would stand for millennia. King Cecrops served as judge, while the common people watched with the mixture of excitement and nervousness that comes from witnessing events that will shape the future of generations yet unborn. Poseidon stepped forward first, his trident gleaming like captured ocean waves in the morning light. The Earthshaker raised his great three-pronged weapon high above his head and brought it down with tremendous force upon the rocky ground. The impact sent tremors through the earth, and from the point where his trident struck, water began to bubble and flow. A spring had appeared, clear and abundant, its waters reflecting the sky like a mirror set in stone. The people gasped in amazement, for water was precious beyond gold in the dry Mediterranean climate, and here was an endless supply flowing directly from the living rock. Poseidon gestured proudly toward his gift, speaking of the power it represented: dominion over the seas, success in trade and naval warfare, the strength to build an empire that would span the known world. But as the initial excitement faded and some of the braver citizens approached to taste this miraculous water, disappointment replaced wonder. The spring, fed by Poseidon's connection to the sea, ran salt rather than fresh. While impressive to behold, it could neither quench thirst nor water crops. It was a gift of power, certainly, but not one that would serve the daily needs of ordinary people. Now Athena stepped forward, her grey eyes thoughtful and serene. She carried no dramatic weapon, no tool of obvious power. Instead, she knelt gracefully upon the rocky soil and pressed something small into the earth, so small that those watching had to strain to see what she had planted there. For a moment, nothing seemed to happen. The crowd grew restless, wondering if the goddess of wisdom had somehow failed to provide a gift at all. Then, as they watched in growing amazement, a green shoot appeared at the spot where Athena knelt. The shoot grew with visible speed, thickening and rising, putting forth branches and leaves that rustled in the gentle breeze. Within minutes, a fully mature tree stood before them, an olive tree, its silvery green leaves shimmering in the sunlight and its branches heavy with ripe fruit. The goddess rose and gestured toward her gift, explaining its many virtues with the calm authority of one who understood the true needs of civilized life. The olive tree, she told them, would provide food for their tables. The fruit itself, nutritious and flavorful, but also oil that could be pressed from the olives to light their lamps, cook their food, and anoint their bodies. The wood of the tree would serve for building and for fuel. The leaves could provide medicine for the sick and fodder for animals during harsh seasons. And beyond these practical benefits, the olive tree was a symbol of peace and prosperity, promising that under her protection, the city would flourish through wisdom and diplomacy rather than conquest and war. The choice was clear to King Cecrops and his people. While Poseidon's gift was impressive and spoke of power and dominance, Athena's olive tree offered something far more precious, the foundation of a civilized and prosperous life. Without hesitation, they declared Athena the winner of the contest, and the city took her name, becoming Athens in honor of their new patron goddess. Poseidon, as might be expected, was not pleased by this decision. The god of earthquakes and storms had expected his dramatic display of power to overwhelm the mortals' judgment, and he felt both insulted and cheated by their choice. In his anger, he caused floods to wash over the coastal regions of Attica, sending salt water surging inland to remind the Athenians of the power they had chosen to reject. But the Athenians, protected now by Athena's wisdom and guidance, weathered this divine tantrum and emerged stronger than before. They built their city around the sacred olive tree, creating temples and public spaces that would honor their patron goddess for centuries to come. The original tree that Athena had planted was said to be the ancestor of all olive trees in Attica, and certain sacred groves were protected by law and religious custom, their oil used only for the most important religious ceremonies. Speaking of trees and nature, do you have a favorite tree or plant that holds special meaning for you? For me, it has to be the ancient oak. There's something about their longevity and strength that speaks to the enduring power of wisdom. Athena's olive tree carries that same sense of permanence and practical value. Now, let us explore how this wisdom goddess used her gifts to help heroes in their greatest moments of need. Among all the gods of Olympus, none was more beloved by heroes than grey-eyed Athena. While other deities might be capricious in their support, alternately helping and hindering mortals based on whim or personal grievance, Athena's aid was consistent and reliable, but only for those who demonstrated the qualities she valued most highly: courage, intelligence, and a dedication to justice. Perhaps no hero received more consistent guidance from Athena than clever Odysseus, the king of Ithaca, whose adventures Homer immortalized in the Odyssey. From the very beginning of that great epic, Athena appears as Odysseus's divine advocate, arguing his case before Zeus and the assembled gods when the hero finds himself trapped on Calypso's island, desperate to return home to his wife and son. What Athena saw in Odysseus was a kindred spirit, a mortal whose mind worked much like her own, always seeking the strategic solution, the clever plan that would overcome obstacles through intelligence rather than brute force. When other heroes relied on raw strength or divine ancestry, Odysseus succeeded through careful observation, creative thinking, and the ability to adapt his tactics to whatever challenges he faced. Throughout his long journey home from Troy, Athena appeared to Odysseus in many forms, sometimes as herself, in all her divine majesty, but more often disguised as helpful mortals who offered just the right advice at the crucial moment. She guided him through encounters with the Cyclops Polyphemus, helped him resist the deadly song of the sirens, and protected him during his dangerous passage between Scylla and Charybdis. But perhaps Athena's most impressive intervention on Odysseus's behalf came when he finally reached Ithaca, only to find his palace overrun with suitors who were consuming his wealth and pressuring his wife Penelope to choose a new husband. Here was a situation that called for all of Athena's specialties: strategic planning, careful disguise, and the kind of justice that could only be achieved through wisdom combined with righteous violence. The goddess transformed Odysseus into an aged beggar, allowing him to enter his own palace unrecognized and assess the situation without alerting his enemies. She arranged for him to reveal himself to his son Telemachus at just the right moment, creating an alliance between father and son that would prove crucial in the battles to come. And when the time came for the final confrontation with the suitors, Athena stood beside her favorite hero, deflecting arrows and ensuring that justice was served with devastating efficiency. But Odysseus was far from the only hero to benefit from Athena's guidance. The young Perseus, faced with the seemingly impossible task of slaying the Gorgon Medusa, received crucial aid from the grey-eyed goddess. She provided him with her polished bronze shield, its mirror-bright surface allowing him to look upon Medusa's reflection without being turned to stone. More importantly, she guided his hand as he struck the killing blow, ensuring that his sword found its mark despite the terrible danger he faced. The story of Perseus and Medusa reveals another aspect of Athena's character, her complex relationship with justice and punishment. For Medusa had not always been a monster with snakes for hair and a gaze that turned living beings to stone. Once she had been a beautiful priestess in Athena's own temple, devoted to the goddess and sworn to maintain her chastity in sacred service. But Poseidon, ever lustful and violent, had seen Medusa's beauty and desired her. When she fled to Athena's temple seeking protection, the sea god followed her even there, violating both the young woman and the sacred space in his selfish passion. Medusa cried out to her patron goddess for help, but Athena's response was not what the priestess had expected or hoped for. Rather than punishing Poseidon, her uncle and a fellow Olympian whose power rivaled her own, Athena turned her anger upon the victim. She transformed Medusa's beautiful hair into writhing snakes and cursed her with the deadly gaze, arguing that Medusa's very beauty had been the cause of the sacrilege. This transformation was presented as both punishment and protection: punishment for allowing the temple to be defiled, but also protection against any future such attacks. This aspect of Athena's mythology reveals the sometimes harsh nature of ancient Greek justice, where the victim of a crime might be held partially responsible for the circumstances that allowed it to occur. It also shows how even the wisest of gods could be influenced by the complex political relationships of Olympus, where challenging a powerful fellow deity might have consequences that extended far beyond the immediate situation. Yet Athena's decision to help Perseus slay Medusa years later suggests a certain evolution in her thinking, or perhaps a recognition that her original punishment had created a monster that threatened innocent people. By guiding Perseus's hand and accepting Medusa's severed head as an offering to place upon her Aegis, Athena in some sense took responsibility for both the creation and the destruction of the Gorgon. The head of Medusa, once attached to Athena's shield, became one of the goddess's most recognizable symbols, the Gorgonian, whose terrible power could be turned against any enemy of justice. It served as a reminder that wisdom, while generally beneficial, could also be terrible when roused to righteous anger. Athena's relationship with Heracles, the strongest of all heroes, demonstrated yet another facet of her divine nature. Where her aid to Odysseus relied primarily on cleverness and her help to Perseus involved providing the right tools at the crucial moment, her assistance to Heracles was more direct and physical, befitting a hero whose challenges required both strategic thinking and tremendous strength. During Heracles' famous 12 labors, Athena appeared at several crucial moments to provide guidance and support. When he faced the Nemean lion, whose golden hide could not be pierced by any weapon, it was Athena who suggested that he use the lion's own claws to skin it after strangling the beast with his bare hands. The resulting lion-skin cloak became Heracles' signature protection, proof against most mortal weapons. For the labor involving the Stymphalian birds, man-eating creatures with bronze beaks and metallic feathers that they could launch like arrows, Athena provided Heracles with bronze rattles created by Hephaestus. The noise from these instruments startled the birds into flight, allowing Heracles to shoot them down with his bow as they wheeled overhead in confusion. Most memorably, during Heracles' quest to obtain the golden apples of the Hesperides, Athena helped him convince Atlas to retrieve the apples while Heracles temporarily held up the heavens. When Atlas, relieved of his eternal burden, tried to trick Heracles into taking over the task permanently, it was Athena's whispered advice that allowed the hero to trick Atlas back into resuming his cosmic duty. Have you ever had to solve a problem that required both strength and strategy working together? For me, it has to be learning to balance demanding work with creative pursuits. Sometimes you need the persistence of Heracles and the strategic thinking of Athena combined. But let us now turn to one of Athena's most famous mythological contests, where her mastery of the crafts would be challenged by a mortal weaver of extraordinary skill. In the ancient kingdom of Lydia, in a modest town where the scent of dyed wool hung perpetually in the air, there lived a young woman named Arachne, whose skill with thread and loom had become legendary throughout the region. She was the daughter of Idmon, a dyer whose specialty was the rich purple that came from murex shells, a colour so expensive that only royalty could afford to wear it regularly. Arachne had inherited her father's eye for colour and texture, but her true gift went far beyond mere technical competence. When she sat at her loom, her fingers seemed to move with their own intelligence, creating patterns of such beauty and complexity that people travelled from distant cities just to witness her work. The tapestries that emerged from her loom were not mere cloth, but stories told in thread scenes so lifelike that viewers expected the figures woven into them to step forth and speak. The mountain nymphs would abandon their streams and groves to watch Arachne work, marvelling at the grace with which she handled the shuttle, the sure confidence of every movement as she built up her intricate designs thread by thread. Watching her weave was like witnessing a form of magic, though Arachne herself insisted it was nothing more than skill developed through years of dedicated practice. As word of Arachne's extraordinary talent spread, people began to whisper that surely she must have been taught by Athena herself, the goddess of all handicrafts and the patron of those who worked with their hands to create beauty and utility. Who else but the grey-eyed goddess could have imparted such perfect understanding of the weaver's art? But when these suggestions reached Arachne's ears, they sparked a fierce pride that quickly grew into something more dangerous. She had worked for years to develop her skill, spending countless hours at the loom while other young women were dancing or flirting or pursuing the usual pleasures of youth. Every technique she had mastered, every innovation she had developed, every breathtaking effect she could achieve with coloured threads, all of this was the product of her own dedication and natural talent. "I have learned my craft through my own efforts," Arachne would declare to anyone who would listen. "No goddess taught me these techniques. I have surpassed even what the immortals can achieve, for my work shows life and truth while theirs is merely divine showing off. If Athena herself were to challenge me to a weaving contest, I would defeat her easily." Such words, spoken with the confidence of youth and genius, were bound to reach divine ears eventually. Athena, hearing of this mortal's boastful claims, felt her immortal anger beginning to kindle. It was one thing for humans to take pride in their accomplishments. Indeed, she generally approved of mortals who strove for excellence in their crafts. But it was quite another thing for a mortal to claim superiority over a goddess, to suggest that divine skill was inferior to human achievement. Yet Athena was wise as well as proud, and her first impulse was not toward immediate punishment, but toward correction. Perhaps this young weaver simply needed guidance to understand the proper relationship between mortal skill and divine inspiration. Perhaps a gentle reminder of her place in the cosmic order would restore appropriate humility without the need for harsher measures. Disguising herself as an elderly woman bent with age and supported by a walking stick, Athena made her way to Arachne's workshop. The transformation was complete in every detail. Her grey eyes became milky with cataracts, her smooth divine skin showed the wrinkles and spots of great age, and her voice took on the tremulous quality of someone whose strength was nearly spent. She found Arachne at her loom, working on a tapestry that depicted a garden scene so realistic that butterflies seemed ready to alight on the woven flowers. The disguised goddess approached slowly, her cane tapping against the floor, and spoke in the voice of a grandmother offering hard-won wisdom to an impetuous grandchild. "My dear child," Athena said in her aged disguise, "I have heard much talk of your remarkable skill, and I can see with my own eyes that the stories do not exaggerate. Your work is indeed beautiful beyond description, but I must offer you some advice, born of many years of watching mortals make dangerous mistakes. Arachne looked up from her loom with barely concealed impatience, her young face showing the irritation of someone whose concentration has been interrupted by what she perceived as an irrelevant intrusion. Still, she had been raised to show respect for her elders, so she set down her shuttle and gave the old woman her attention. "Take pride in your gift, by all means," the disguised goddess continued, "for it is clear that you possess exceptional talent. Claim your place as the finest weaver among mortals, and let that be honor enough. But do not make the mistake of comparing your work to that of the immortal gods. Such comparisons can only bring sorrow, for the gods do not forgive those who claim equality with them. Humble yourself before Athena, ask her forgiveness for your boastful words, and I am certain she will pardon your youthful pride." These words, intended as merciful guidance, struck Arachne like a slap across the face. Her eyes flashed with indignation, and she leaped up from her stool with such violence that her threads tangled in the sudden movement. The careful control she had maintained during the conversation fell away, revealing the full intensity of her wounded pride. "How dare you!" she cried, her voice ringing through the workshop like the clash of metal on metal. "I need no forgiveness from any goddess, for I have done nothing wrong. I have spoken only the truth about my abilities. If Athena takes offense at the truth, then let her come here herself and prove her superiority. I challenge her to a contest of skill. Let us see whose hands are truly more capable." The moment these words left Arachne's lips, the air in the workshop began to shimmer and change. The bent old woman straightened slowly, her cane transforming into a spear, her aged features becoming smooth and beautiful, her dim eyes blazing with the grey fire of storm clouds heavy with lightning. The humble woolen dress became gleaming armor, and a great owl materialized on her shoulder, its golden eyes fixed unblinkingly on the terrified mortal. Athena stood revealed in all her divine majesty, terrible and beautiful beyond mortal comprehension. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the authority of wisdom itself, but underneath the measured words ran a current of anger that made the very walls tremble. "Your challenge is accepted, presumptuous mortal," the goddess said, each word falling like a hammer blow upon an anvil. "Let us indeed discover whose skill is superior. But know this, when I defeat you, as I surely will, the consequences of your hubris will be far more severe than if you had accepted my merciful offer of forgiveness." Word of the divine weaving contest spread through the region with the speed of wildfire. People abandoned their daily tasks and travelled from great distances to witness this unprecedented event, a direct competition between a mortal, however skilled, and one of the 12 great gods of Olympus. Even the local nymphs and minor deities gathered to watch, their immortal eyes bright with curiosity about the outcome. 2 looms were set up side by side in Arachne's workshop, each identical in size and construction, each strung with threads of the finest quality. The tension in the air was almost palpable as goddess and mortal took their positions, ready to begin the contest that would determine not just the superior weaver, but the fate of the young woman who had dared to challenge divine authority. Both contestants began their work at the same moment, their hands moving with fluid grace as they selected threads and began to build their designs. The watchers pressed close, their eyes darting back and forth between the 2 looms, trying to discern which weaver held the advantage in this most unusual of competitions. Athena's tapestry took shape with the measured perfection of divine craft. Her subject was a celebration of the gods themselves and their righteous relationship with mortals. At the center of her work, she wove the scene of her own contest with Poseidon for the patronage of Athens, showing herself offering the olive tree while her uncle created his salt spring. The figures were rendered with flawless accuracy, every detail perfect, every proportion exactly as it should be. But it was in the 4 corners of her tapestry that Athena's true message became clear. There she wove scenes of mortals who had challenged the gods and suffered terrible consequences for their presumption. In one corner, she showed the daughters of Cecrops being transformed into birds for looking upon forbidden secrets. In another, she depicted Pygmaea being turned into a crane for boasting that her hair was more beautiful than Hera's. Each scene served as a warning, a reminder of what happened to those who forgot their proper place in the cosmic order. Arachne's work, meanwhile, took a very different approach to the relationship between gods and mortals. Her tapestry was every bit as technically perfect as Athena's. Indeed, in some ways, it seemed even more lifelike, as if the figures might step off the cloth and move among the watchers. But where Athena had chosen to depict divine justice and mortal hubris, Arachne focused on divine injustice and the suffering of innocent mortals. Her central scene showed Zeus in his many disguises as he pursued mortal women, transforming himself into a bull to seduce Europa, becoming a swan to ravish Leda, taking the form of a shower of gold to reach Danae in her prison tower. Around this central panel, she wove scene after scene of divine abuse of power. Poseidon's various rapes and seductions, Apollo's pursuit of unwilling nymphs, the cruel punishments inflicted by Artemis on those who accidentally offended her. Each figure in Arachne's tapestry was rendered with such skill that viewers could feel the emotions portrayed, the terror of the pursued mortals, the callous lust of the pursuing gods, the grief of parents whose children had been stolen or transformed. It was a work of devastating artistic power, a condemnation of divine behaviour delivered through the medium of thread and colour. As both tapestries neared completion, the tension in the workshop grew almost unbearable. Even the immortal watchers seemed to hold their breath as they witnessed this unprecedented display of skill from both divine and mortal hands. Never before had anyone seen such perfect weaving, such complete mastery of an art that required both technical precision and creative vision. When both contestants finally set down their shuttles and stepped back from their completed works, a profound silence fell over the assembly. Both tapestries were masterpieces beyond anything that had ever been created before. Athena's work displayed the flawless perfection of divine craft, every thread in its perfect place, every image radiating the authority and power of the gods. Arachne's tapestry matched that technical perfection while also achieving something even rarer, a depth of emotional truth that seemed to bring the woven figures to actual life. For a long moment, Athena stared at the mortal girl's work, and in her grey eyes the watchers saw something that shocked them to their cores. It was not anger at being challenged or outrage at the subject matter, though both emotions were certainly present. It was something far more dangerous to a goddess's pride. It was the recognition that Arachne's boast had not been empty after all. The mortal's work was not merely equal to divine craftsmanship, in some ways it surpassed it. But rather than graciously acknowledging Arachne's superior skill, Athena's anger blazed forth with terrifying intensity. She raised her hand and struck the tapestry, tearing the beautiful work to shreds with supernatural force. Then she turned upon Arachne herself, transforming her weaving shuttle into a rod of boxwood and striking the young woman repeatedly about the head and shoulders. "You dare to mock the gods with your weaving," Athena cried, her voice terrible in its divine wrath. "You dare to depict us as monsters and criminals. You will learn the price of such presumption." Arachne, overwhelmed by both physical pain and the spiritual agony of seeing her masterwork destroyed, could bear no more. In despair and defeat, she fashioned a noose from some of her own thread and hanged herself, choosing death over the humiliation of divine punishment and the loss of everything that had given her life meaning. But even in death, Arachne was not to find peace. As her body swayed from the makeshift rope, Athena felt a sudden pang of something that might have been remorse, or perhaps simply a recognition that the punishment had exceeded the crime. The goddess reached out and loosened the noose, but rather than restoring Arachne to life, she transformed both the rope and the young woman herself. The noose became a spider's web, intricate and beautiful but also fragile and easily destroyed. Arachne herself became the first spider, her human form condensing into the small, many-legged creature that would bear her name for all time. In this new form, she retained her supreme skill at weaving, but now she was condemned to practice her art in miniature, creating webs that, no matter how perfect, would always be vulnerable to destruction by careless passers-by. "Weave now for all eternity," Athena pronounced, her anger finally beginning to cool as she looked down at the small creature that had once been her challenger. "Let your skill be forever displayed, but let it also be forever at risk, and let your fate serve as a warning to any other mortals who might think to compare their abilities to those of the immortal gods." As Arachne scuttled away to begin her eternal weaving in whatever dark corner she could find, the assembled watchers dispersed in thoughtful silence. They had witnessed something unprecedented, a contest between mortal and divine skill that had ended not in clear victory for either side, but in a transformation that seemed to satisfy no one fully. Arachne's fate served as the warning Athena intended, but it also raised uncomfortable questions about the justice of divine punishment and the price of artistic excellence. And perhaps that was the true lesson of the contest, that the relationship between mortals and gods is never simple, that even wisdom can be cruel when combined with wounded pride, and that the greatest talents sometimes carry within them the seeds of their own destruction. Which brings us to another famous contest in Athena's mythology, one that would have consequences reaching far beyond the immediate participants and would ultimately lead to the greatest war in all of Greek legend. The story began, as so many tales of divine mischief do, at a wedding, specifically the marriage of the mortal hero Peleus to the sea nymph Thetis. This was no ordinary union, for Thetis was destined to bear a son greater than his father, and Zeus himself had courted her until learning of this prophecy. Rather than risk being overthrown by his own offspring, the king of the gods had arranged for Thetis to marry a mortal, ensuring that her prophesied son would be mighty but not divinely so. All the gods and goddesses were invited to this glorious celebration, which took place in a setting of unparalleled beauty on the slopes of Mount Pelion. The wedding feast was magnificent, with nectar flowing freely and ambrosia served on golden plates. Music filled the air as the muses sang of love and destiny, while the bride and groom exchanged vows that would bind them together through whatever fate awaited their future son. But there was one goddess who had been deliberately excluded from the guest list, Eris, the personification of discord and strife. The other gods had learned from bitter experience that inviting Eris to any gathering was a guarantee of trouble, for her very nature compelled her to sow dissension wherever she went. Better, they had decided, to celebrate without her and hope she would not notice the slight. Eris did notice, of course, and her anger at being snubbed burned with the intensity of wounded pride. If the gods thought they could exclude her from their festivities, she would show them the folly of their decision in a way they would never forget. From her dark realm, she crafted a gift that would serve as both wedding present and revenge, a golden apple of perfect beauty, inscribed with a simple message that would prove anything but simple in its consequences: to the fairest. In the middle of the celebration, when laughter rang loudest and the wine had made the gods most relaxed and careless, Eris appeared suddenly in their midst and hurled the golden apple among the assembled goddesses. Then, with a laugh that held no mirth but promised endless trouble, she vanished as quickly as she had come, leaving chaos in her wake. The apple rolled to a stop in the center of the gathering, its golden surface catching the light like captured sunshine, its inscription clearly visible to all who gathered around it. For a moment, silence fell over the celebration as everyone stared at this unexpected and ominous gift. Then, almost simultaneously, 3 voices spoke up to claim ownership of the apple. "Clearly this belongs to me," declared Hera, Zeus's wife and queen of the gods, drawing herself up to her full majestic height. "I am the highest-ranking goddess here, the wife of the king of Olympus himself. Who could be fairer than the queen of all the gods?" "I beg to differ," interrupted Aphrodite, her voice like honey and silver bells combined. She stepped forward with the fluid grace that made hearts skip beats and wars begin, her beauty so radiant that even the other goddesses had to acknowledge its power. "I am beauty itself, the very essence of fairness made divine. This apple can belong to no one else." But before either could reach for the golden fruit, Athena moved forward with the measured pace of wisdom, considering all possibilities. Her grey eyes were thoughtful rather than eager, but her voice carried complete conviction when she spoke. "Both of your claims have merit," she said diplomatically, "but neither takes into account the full meaning of fairness. True fairness encompasses not merely physical beauty or political rank, but wisdom, justice, and the kind of inner beauty that comes from right thinking and noble action. By those measures, surely the apple should be mine." What followed was a debate that grew increasingly heated as each goddess marshaled arguments for her superiority and pointed out the flaws in her rivals' claims. Hera spoke of her dignity and authority, her role as protector of marriage and family, her right as Zeus's consort to precedence over all other females. Aphrodite countered with displays of her legendary beauty and reminders of her power over the hearts of gods and mortals alike. Athena maintained her position with logical arguments about the superiority of wisdom over mere appearance or inherited rank. The other gods watched this developing conflict with growing unease, for they could see that what had started as a simple disagreement was rapidly escalating towards something far more serious. When goddesses of such power began to quarrel seriously, the consequences could shake the foundations of both heaven and earth. Zeus, recognizing the danger, attempted to defuse the situation by suggesting that perhaps the apple should be divided among the three claimants, or alternatively, that its inscription was merely a general compliment with no specific recipient intended. But his diplomatic efforts fell on deaf ears, as each goddess remained convinced that she alone deserved the prize. Realizing that no solution could be found that would satisfy all three contestants, and unwilling to make a choice that would inevitably anger two of them, Zeus made a decision that would have far-reaching consequences. He declared that the matter should be judged by a neutral party, specifically by a mortal whose opinion could not be influenced by divine politics or family relationships. The mortal chosen for this impossible task was Paris, a prince of Troy who was known for his fairness and his appreciation of beauty in all its forms. At the time, Paris was living as a shepherd on Mount Ida, having been exposed as an infant due to a prophecy that he would one day bring destruction to his city. Rescued and raised by mountain folk, he had grown into a young man of remarkable beauty himself, with an eye for aesthetics that made him seem like the perfect judge for such a contest. Hermes was dispatched to bring the three goddesses to Paris's mountain pasture, where the young shepherd received the shock of his life when three of the most powerful beings in creation suddenly materialized before him, each claiming to be the fairest and demanding his judgment in their dispute. What Paris could not have known was that each goddess had prepared more than mere arguments for his consideration. As soon as they realized that their fate lay in the hands of a mortal judge, each began to devise bribes that would sway his decision in her favor. Hera, drawing upon her role as queen of the gods and protector of kingdoms, offered Paris political power beyond his wildest dreams. She promised to make him the ruler of all Asia, to give him dominion over vast empires and countless subjects. Under her patronage, he would become the most powerful monarch the world had ever seen, his name remembered for all time as a great king and conqueror. Athena, true to her nature as the goddess of wisdom and strategic warfare, offered him intellectual and military supremacy. She promised to make him the wisest man alive, the greatest strategist and warrior who had ever drawn breath. Under her guidance, he would win every battle, solve every problem, and be revered throughout history as the most brilliant mind of his generation. But Aphrodite, understanding the heart of a young man better than her rivals, offered something that appealed to more immediate and personal desires. She promised Paris the love of the most beautiful woman in the world, Helen of Sparta, whose beauty was so legendary that she was said to be the daughter of Zeus himself, born from an egg after the god had seduced her mother Leda in the form of a swan. Paris, confronted with these three magnificent offers, found himself in the same impossible position that had faced Zeus. Any choice he made would create powerful enemies while gaining him only one ally. But he was young, and the young are often more swayed by passion than by practical considerations. The promise of Helen's love spoke to something in his heart that the offers of power and wisdom could not touch. After what seemed like an eternity of consideration, Paris made his choice. He awarded the golden apple to Aphrodite, declaring her the fairest of the three goddesses, and accepting her promise of Helen's love as his reward for the decision. The consequences of that choice would echo through the generations that followed, for Helen was already married to Menelaus, king of Sparta, and their union was protected by an oath sworn by all her former suitors. When Paris, aided by Aphrodite's power, successfully abducted Helen and brought her to Troy, he set in motion the chain of events that would lead to the decade-long Trojan War, the fall of his city, and the deaths of countless heroes on both sides of the conflict. For Athena and Hera, Paris's choice was an insult that demanded vengeance. Throughout the war that followed, both goddesses supported the Greek forces against Troy, using all their considerable power to ensure that Paris's city would pay the ultimate price for his judgment. Athena, in particular, became one of the most active participants in the conflict, advising Greek heroes, protecting their ships, and working tirelessly to bring about Troy's destruction. The irony was not lost on those who understood the full story. The contest that began with Eris's apple of discord had indeed brought strife to the world on an unprecedented scale, exactly as the goddess of discord had intended when she crafted her revenge for being excluded from a wedding celebration. But the Trojan War would not be the only time that Athena's wisdom and power would be called upon to shape the course of mortal events. Throughout Greek mythology, we find her appearing at crucial moments, sometimes as a guide and protector, sometimes as an agent of divine justice, always as the embodiment of wisdom applied to the practical challenges of existence. During the war itself, Athena's favoritism toward the Greeks was absolute and unwavering. She appeared on the battlefield in person, driving back Trojan heroes with her terrible war cry and the blazing power of her Aegis. She guided the spears of Greek warriors to their targets while deflecting Trojan weapons away from their intended victims. When Diomedes, one of the greatest Greek heroes, fought against the gods themselves, it was Athena who gave him the supernatural strength and courage to wound even Ares, the god of war. But perhaps Athena's most famous intervention in the Trojan War was her role in the stratagem that finally brought the mighty city to its knees, the infamous Trojan horse. The idea for this masterpiece of deception came from Odysseus, Athena's favorite among mortals, but the goddess herself provided crucial guidance in its planning and execution. The wooden horse was built under her direction, large enough to conceal a force of Greek warriors, but disguised as a religious offering to the gods. When the Greeks pretended to abandon their siege and left the horse outside Troy's walls, it was Athena who ensured that the Trojans would be deceived by the ruse, clouding their judgment so that they would drag the horse inside their city despite the warnings of the prophet Cassandra and the priest Laocoon. That night, as Troy slept in celebration of what they believed was their deliverance, Athena guided the Greek warriors as they emerged from their hiding place within the horse and opened the city's gates to their returning army. The fall of Troy was swift and brutal, the culmination of 10 years of warfare and divine intervention. Yet even in her triumph, Athena demonstrated the complex nature of divine justice. When Ajax the Lesser violated Cassandra in Athena's own temple during the sack of the city, the goddess's anger turned against the Greeks themselves. Though she had supported them throughout the war, this final sacrilege was more than even her partisan spirit could bear. As the Greek fleet prepared to sail home with their Trojan captives and plunder, Athena conspired with Poseidon to send a terrible storm that scattered the ships across the Mediterranean. Many of the Greek heroes who had survived 10 years of warfare perished in the waves or found themselves cast upon foreign shores far from their homes and families. It was a reminder that divine favor, once lost, could turn to devastating vengeance with terrifying swiftness. Now, as we drift deeper into this tale of divine wisdom and mortal folly, let me ask you this. What do you think is more important in facing life's challenges? Raw strength, clever strategy, or unwavering moral principles? For me, it has to be the combination of strategy and principles that Athena embodied so perfectly. Pure strength without wisdom often leads to destruction, while cleverness without morality can become mere manipulation. But let us continue our journey through Athena's realm, exploring how she was worshipped and honored by the mortals who sought her guidance. In the ancient world, no goddess was more widely or more devotedly worshipped than grey-eyed Athena. From the marble temples of Athens to humble household shrines in distant colonies, her owl-shaped oil lamps burned bright, and her sacred olive branches adorned altars throughout the Greek world. But it was in Athens itself, the city that bore her name, that Athena's worship reached its most magnificent expression. The Athenians understood that their prosperity, their democracy, their reputation for wisdom and culture, all of these blessings flowed from their special relationship with their patron goddess. They honored her not merely with prayers and sacrifices, though these were abundant, but with festivals of such splendor that visitors from across the Mediterranean would time their travels to witness these celebrations of divine wisdom. The greatest of these festivals was the Panathenaea, held every 4 years in midsummer when the heat shimmered off the marble of the Acropolis and the cicadas sang their ancient songs in the olive groves. For months beforehand, the entire city would prepare for this celebration, with every citizen from the wealthiest aristocrat to the humblest potter contributing to the festival's success. At the heart of the Panathenaea was the peplos, a magnificent robe woven specifically for Athena's cult statue. This was no ordinary garment, but a masterpiece of textile art that took an entire year to complete. The finest weavers in Athens, young women chosen for their skill and virtue, worked throughout the year on this sacred project, creating cloth of such beauty and complexity that it was worthy of the goddess who had invented their craft. The peplos was woven with scenes from Athena's mythology, her birth from Zeus's head, her contest with Poseidon for Athens, her battles against the giants who had threatened the Olympian order. Every thread was chosen with care, every image rendered with devotional precision, for this robe would clothe the most sacred image of their patron goddess, the ancient wooden statue that was said to have fallen from heaven itself in the earliest days of their city. As the festival approached, the excitement in Athens became almost palpable. Visitors streamed into the city from colonies and allied states, bringing gifts for the goddess and hoping to witness the greatest celebration in the Greek world. The agora filled with merchants selling everything from sacred olive oil to miniature owl figurines, while poets and musicians prepared to compete for prizes in Athena's honor. On the morning of the great procession, the entire population of Athens gathered in the Kerameikos, the potter's quarter that lay outside the city walls. Here, as the first light of dawn touched the temples on the Acropolis, the sacred procession began to form a river of humanity that stretched for miles and included every element of Athenian society. At the head of the procession walked the priestess of Athena, clothed in white robes and bearing the sacred implements of her office. Behind her came the specially chosen young women carrying the peplos, the precious garment stretched between them like a sail catching the morning breeze. The robe was so large and magnificent that it required multiple bearers, and as it moved through the streets, onlookers gasped at the beauty of its intricate designs. Following the peplos came representatives of every aspect of Athenian life, magistrates in their official robes, young men who would soon serve as warriors, elderly citizens who remembered past festivals, craftsmen carrying examples of their finest work, farmers leading animals for sacrifice, musicians playing hymns of praise, and children scattering flower petals in the goddess's honor. The procession moved slowly through the city, pausing at various shrines and altars where prayers were offered and libations poured. the route took them past the most important public buildings, allowing the goddess to symbolically bless every aspect of civic life as her festival parade wound through the streets that bore her protection. As the procession climbed the steep path to the Acropolis, the anticipation reached its peak. This sacred hill, crowned with temples that gleamed like jewels in the morning sun, was the heart of Athena's worship and the symbol of Athens' devotion to their patron goddess. The great gateway of the Propylaea opened before them like the entrance to heaven itself, and beyond it lay the Parthenon, the most perfect temple ever built by human hands. Inside the Parthenon stood Athena Parthenos, the colossal statue created by the master sculptor Phidias, a work of art so magnificent that many who saw it were moved to tears. The statue stood 40 feet tall, carved from ivory and gold, showing the goddess in all her divine majesty. Her helmet bore the figures of griffins and the Sphinx, her Aegis displayed the head of Medusa, and her spear rested against her shoulder while her shield, decorated with scenes of the battle between gods and giants, stood at her feet. This was not merely a work of art, but a divine presence made visible, a focus for the devotion of an entire people. The gold alone, 44 talents of the precious metal, represented a fortune beyond calculation, but to the Athenians, no expense was too great when it came to honoring the goddess who had made their city the wonder of the world. The peplos ceremony that culminated the festival was a moment of profound spiritual intensity. As the magnificent robe was carefully placed upon the statue, the assembled worshippers felt the presence of their goddess in a way that transcended normal religious experience. This was their patron, their protector, their guide, not some distant deity who might or might not pay attention to mortal affairs, but a goddess who had chosen them, who lived among them, who shared in their triumphs and defended them in their times of need. But the Panathenaea was more than just a religious ceremony. It was also a celebration of everything that made Athens great. Athletic competitions rivaled those of the Olympic Games, with prizes of specially decorated amphora filled with sacred olive oil from Athena's grove. Poets competed to create new hymns in the goddess's honor, while musicians sought to compose melodies worthy of divine ears. Even the poorest citizens could participate, for the festival sacrifices provided free meat for all, ensuring that everyone could share in the celebration regardless of their economic circumstances. The evening of the great festival concluded with a panichos, an all-night celebration on the Acropolis itself. As darkness fell over the city, torches were lit throughout the sacred precinct, creating a constellation of light that could be seen for miles. The young people of Athens danced through the night, their movements casting shifting shadows on the temple walls, while singers chanted hymns and told stories of their goddess's mighty deeds. In smaller communities throughout the Greek world, Athena's worship took more modest but no less heartfelt forms. Village temples housed simple wooden statues or even just painted images of the owl-eyed goddess, but the devotion of their worshippers was no less sincere than that of wealthy Athenians. Craftsmen would dedicate their finest work to her, asking for skill in their trades. Mothers would pray to her for wisdom in raising their children. Soldiers departing for war would seek her blessing for victory through strategic brilliance rather than mere bloodshed. The goddess responded to these prayers in ways both subtle and dramatic. Potters found their hands steadier and their glazes more brilliant. Weavers discovered new patterns emerging from their looms. Students of philosophy experienced moments of insight that seemed to come from beyond their own minds. And warriors reported dreams in which a grey-eyed woman showed them the weak points in enemy formations or whispered strategies that led to victory against overwhelming odds. These personal relationships with Athena were perhaps even more important than the great public festivals, for they demonstrated that wisdom was not the exclusive province of philosophers and kings, but was available to anyone who approached the goddess with sincere respect and genuine desire for understanding. The olive oil that burned in countless household lamps carried the prayers of ordinary people to extraordinary heights, creating a continuous connection between the mortal and divine realms. In art and literature, Athena's image evolved over the centuries, but certain elements remained constant. The owl that symbolized wisdom, the olive tree that represented peace and prosperity, the Aegis that showed divine protection, and always those piercing grey eyes that seemed to see straight through to the truth of any situation. Painters and sculptors competed to capture her essence, while poets found in her mythology an endless source of stories that spoke to fundamental human concerns about justice, wisdom, and the proper relationship between mortals and immortals. The philosophical schools of Athens claimed her as their patron, arguing that the pursuit of wisdom was the highest form of worship she could receive. The Academy of Plato and the Lyceum of Aristotle both invoked her blessing on their endeavours, seeing in philosophical inquiry a sacred activity that brought human minds closer to divine understanding. Even in the declining years of classical civilization, when new religions began to challenge the old gods, Athena retained her hold on human imagination. Early Christian writers, while rejecting her divinity, often praised her as an embodiment of divine wisdom that prefigured their own theological concepts. The owl remained a symbol of learning and wisdom long after the goddess's temples fell silent, carrying forward at least a fragment of her ancient power into new ages and new forms of belief. What's fascinating about all these forms of worship and devotion is how they reflect the multifaceted nature of Athena herself, goddess of war, but also of peace, patron of crafts, but also of philosophy, divine wisdom made accessible to mortal minds through patience, study, and genuine reverence for truth in all its forms. As we near the end of our long journey through Athena's mythology, it's worth reflecting on what makes her story so enduringly powerful. In a pantheon filled with gods who were often petty, jealous, or driven by passion, Athena stood apart as the embodiment of wisdom applied to practical challenges. She was never perfect. Her treatment of Arachne shows the dangerous side of wounded pride, even divine pride. But she represented ideals that humans could aspire to: strategic thinking, respect for justice, mastery of useful skills, and the kind of wisdom that serves others rather than merely aggrandizing the self. Her relationship with heroes like Odysseus and Perseus demonstrates something important about the nature of divine aid. The gods help those who help themselves, but they particularly favor those who combine courage with intelligence, strength with strategy, and personal ambition with genuine concern for justice. Athena didn't make her favorites invincible, but she gave them the tools and guidance they needed to overcome challenges through their own efforts, enhanced by divine wisdom. In our modern world, where we face complex problems that require both intellectual rigor and practical action, Athena's example remains surprisingly relevant. She reminds us that wisdom without application is merely academic exercise, while action without wisdom often leads to unintended consequences that create more problems than they solve. The grey-eyed goddess teaches us that true strength comes not from overwhelming force, but from understanding ourselves, understanding our challenges, understanding the tools and resources available to us, and understanding the ethical implications of our choices. She shows us that the highest form of victory is not the destruction of our enemies, but the creation of conditions where conflicts can be resolved through wisdom and justice rather than violence and oppression. Perhaps most importantly, Athena's story reminds us that wisdom is not a static possession but a dynamic process, something that must be continually renewed, questioned, and applied to new situations as they arise. The owl that was her symbol saw clearly in the darkness, suggesting that true wisdom allows us to perceive truth even when circumstances are confusing or threatening. As the night deepens around you and this tale of divine wisdom draws to its close, let the image of grey-eyed Athena linger in your mind, born fully armed from the head of Zeus, but choosing to use her weapons in service of justice, patron of crafts that transform raw materials into objects of beauty and utility, guide to heroes who must navigate between divine commands and human limitations. In her temples, the oil lamps may have been extinguished long ago, and the voices that once sang her hymns may have fallen silent, but the wisdom she represented continues to illuminate human consciousness whenever we choose thoughtful strategy over reckless action, whenever we seek to create rather than merely to consume, whenever we remember that true victory comes not from defeating others but from becoming worthy of the challenges we face. But before we allow sleep to claim us completely, let us delve deeper into the mysteries that make Athena such a uniquely powerful figure in the pantheon of Greek gods. There are layers to her story that deserve closer examination, aspects of her divine nature that reveal profound truths about wisdom, power, and the delicate balance between intellect and force. To truly understand Athena's nature, we must return to that extraordinary moment of her birth and examine it not just as a dramatic mythological event, but as a profound symbol of how pure intellect comes into being. The ancient Greeks, master storytellers that they were, encoded deep philosophical truths into their myths, and nowhere is this more evident than in the tale of how Zeus's terrible headache gave birth to the goddess of wisdom. Picture, if you will, the cosmic significance of that moment when Hephaestus raised his bronze axe above his father's skull. This was not merely the relief of physical pain, but the literal birthing of thought itself into independent existence. For months, Metis' wisdom personified had been trapped within Zeus's consciousness, her essence merging with his divine mind, her knowledge becoming part of his understanding. But wisdom, the Greeks understood, cannot remain forever contained within a single consciousness, no matter how divine. It must be born, must become independent, must take on its own form and agency to truly serve the world. The symbolism of Athena emerging fully grown and fully armed speaks to something profound about the nature of intellectual achievement. Unlike physical birth, which produces helpless infants who must grow slowly into their potential, the birth of true wisdom is instantaneous and complete. When genuine understanding finally breaks through the confusion and pain of mental struggle, that headache of wrestling with complex problems, it arrives not as a tentative possibility, but as fully formed insight, ready immediately to be applied to the challenges at hand. Consider how this mirrors our own experiences of intellectual breakthrough. We struggle with a problem, turning it over and over in our minds until the mental pressure becomes almost unbearable. We feel as though our heads might split from the strain of trying to comprehend something that seems just beyond our grasp. Then, suddenly, understanding arrives, not gradually, not partially, but complete and crystalline, as if it had been there all along, waiting to be born from our mental anguish. The fact that Athena emerged armed and ready for battle adds another layer to this symbolism. Wisdom, the myth tells us, is not a passive quality that sits quietly in ivory towers contemplating abstract truths. True wisdom is an active force, ready to engage with the world's challenges, equipped with both defensive capabilities to protect what is just and offensive weapons to attack what is corrupt or harmful. The armor that Athena wore from the moment of her birth represents the understanding that in a world filled with conflict and confusion, wisdom must be prepared to fight for its principles. Her immediate war cry upon emerging from Zeus's split skull serves as a declaration that wisdom will not be silent or submissive. It announces itself boldly, demands attention, and makes clear that it intends to be a force for change in the world. This is not the gentle wisdom of passive contemplation, but the active wisdom of strategic engagement with reality's complexities. The location of her birth from Zeus's head rather than his body emphasizes that Athena represents intellectual rather than physical or emotional power. She is pure thought given form, uncontaminated by the biological processes that govern mortal existence. This explains why she could remain forever virgin, forever independent of the physical desires and emotional entanglements that so often complicate the lives of both mortals and other gods. Her very essence is mental rather than physical, making her uniquely qualified to see situations clearly without the distorting influence of personal passion. The miraculous healing of Zeus's headache upon Athena's birth suggests something important about the relationship between intellectual struggle and resolution. The pain that comes from wrestling with difficult concepts is not meaningless suffering, but the labor pains of wisdom being born. Once true understanding emerges, the previous confusion and mental anguish disappear completely, replaced by the clarity and confidence that come from genuine knowledge. This birth narrative also establishes Athena's unique position within the Olympian hierarchy. Unlike her siblings, who were born through Zeus's various romantic entanglements with goddesses, titans, and mortal women, Athena's origin involves no other female parent in the conventional sense. While Meti provided the seed of wisdom, it was Zeus's own mind that served as her womb. This makes Athena, in a sense, the most purely Olympian of all the gods, carrying within her the undiluted essence of divine authority tempered by the wisdom that originally belonged to the Titans. The swallowing of Metis that preceded Athena's birth represents the necessary destruction that often accompanies creation. Zeus could not allow Metis to continue existing as an independent entity if he was to prevent the prophecy about a son who would overthrow him. But in consuming her, he did not destroy her wisdom. Instead, he transformed it into something new and even more powerful. Athena emerged as wisdom evolved, no longer bound by the old order of Titan versus Olympian, but representing a synthesis of ancient knowledge and new divine authority. When you think about moments of intellectual breakthrough in your own life, do you remember them arriving suddenly and completely, like Athena from Zeus's head? For me, it has to be those rare instances when a complex problem suddenly makes perfect sense. The solution appears fully formed, as if it had been waiting behind a mental barrier that finally gave way. These moments feel almost magical, like touching something divine. But let us continue exploring the symbols that made Athena so formidable in both wisdom and warfare. The timing of Athena's birth during Zeus's establishment as the supreme ruler of the cosmos is also significant. She arrived just as the new order was being consolidated, positioned perfectly to become the divine embodiment of civilized rule as opposed to the chaotic tyranny that had characterized earlier generations of gods. Her wisdom would guide the development of human civilization, helping mortals learn the arts and skills that would separate them from beasts and elevate them towards something approaching divine perfection. The immediate acceptance of Athena by the other Olympians, despite the dramatic and unprecedented nature of her birth, speaks to the recognition that wisdom had always been lacking in their pantheon. Here was something they had unconsciously been waiting for. Not another god of physical appetites or emotional extremes, but a deity who could provide the strategic thinking and long-term planning that divine governance required. Her presence immediately elevated the intellectual climate of Olympus, introducing principles of justice and rational decision-making that would influence how the gods interacted with both each other and the mortal world below. The weapons and armor that Athena carried from birth deserve special attention, for they were not merely symbolic but functional representations of how wisdom operates in the world. Her spear was not just for physical combat, but represented the penetrating insight that cuts through deception and confusion to reach the truth. Her shield served not only as protection, but as a reflective surface that could reveal hidden realities, much like her later gift of the polished bronze shield to Perseus, which allowed him to see Medusa's deadly reflection rather than her actual face. The helmet that crowned her head from the moment of birth symbolized the protective power of knowledge. Those who possess true wisdom are defended against the confusion and manipulation that so easily overcome the ignorant. They can see through false arguments, recognize deceptive appearances, and navigate complex situations without losing their way. The helmet's crest, often decorated with images of victory and triumph, announced that wisdom is not merely defensive but ultimately victorious over all forms of ignorance and chaos. Of all the divine artifacts in Greek mythology, perhaps none is more simultaneously fascinating and terrifying than Athena's Aegis. that legendary breastplate or shield that bore upon its surface the head of Medusa, the Gorgon whose gaze could turn any living creature to stone. To understand the full significance of this divine armor, we must explore not only its origins and powers, but also the profound symbolism it represents in the complex relationship between wisdom and terror, protection and destruction. The Aegis itself was originally Zeus's exclusive symbol of authority, a supernatural breastplate or shield that represented the ultimate divine protection. When storm clouds gathered and lightning split the sky, ancient Greeks understood that Zeus was donning his Aegis, preparing to demonstrate his power over the forces of chaos. The word Aegis has come down to us in modern language as meaning protection or sponsorship, but its original significance was far more dramatic and absolute. To be under Zeus's Aegis meant to be shielded by the most powerful force in the universe, protected by divine authority that could not be challenged or overcome. That Zeus chose to share this most precious symbol of his power with Athena speaks to the extraordinary trust and affection he felt for his grey-eyed daughter. No other god, not even Hera, his wife, or Apollo, his favoured son, was granted the right to bear the Aegis. This gift established Athena as Zeus's true heir in matters of divine justice and cosmic order, marking her as the deity most qualified to wield ultimate power in service of wisdom and righteousness. But the Aegis that Athena carried was not identical to her father's original. While Zeus's version inspired awe and commanded respect through its association with his thunderbolts and storms, Athena's Aegis carried an additional element that made it uniquely terrifying: the severed head of Medusa, set in the center of the divine armor like a hideous jewel in a crown of power. The story of how Medusa's head came to adorn Athena's Aegis brings us full circle to one of the most complex and troubling episodes in the goddess's mythology. Medusa, as we have explored, had once been a beautiful priestess in Athena's temple, devoted to the goddess and sworn to chastity in her service. When Poseidon violated both the priestess and the sacred space, Athena's response was swift and terrible, but it fell upon the victim rather than the perpetrator. The transformation of Medusa into a monster with snakes for hair and a deadly gaze was presented as both punishment and protection, but the underlying injustice of blaming the victim for her own assault reveals the sometimes harsh and unfair nature of ancient divine justice. Yet when Perseus finally beheaded the Gorgon years later, guided by Athena's own hand and protected by her shield, the goddess claimed the severed head as her own, incorporating it into her most sacred symbol. This act represents something more complex than simple trophy-taking. By placing Medusa's head upon her Aegis, Athena was in some sense taking responsibility for both the creation and the destruction of the monster. She was acknowledging the terrible power that can result from the intersection of beauty, violence, and divine justice gone wrong. The Gorgonian, as the image of Medusa's head was known, served multiple symbolic functions on Athena's Aegis. Most obviously, it was a weapon of incredible power, capable of turning any enemy to stone with a single glance. But it was also a reminder of the terrible consequences that could follow from violating sacred spaces and divine law. Those who looked upon it saw their own mortality reflected in stone, understanding in their final moment that some powers are too great for mortals to challenge or comprehend. The visual impact of Athena wearing the Aegis with Medusa's head must have been overwhelming. Picture the goddess striding across a battlefield, her grey eyes blazing with divine fire, her armor catching the light like captured starfire, and at the center of her breastplate, the terrible face of the Gorgon, snakes writhing where hair should be, eyes that promised instant death to any who dared meet their gaze directly. Enemy warriors would find themselves caught between the impossible choice of looking upon their divine opponent and risking petrification, or averting their eyes and fighting blind against the goddess of strategic warfare. But the Aegis was not merely a weapon of war. In times of peace, it served as a symbol of divine protection that extended over all who sought Athena's guidance and blessing. Cities that honored her could invoke her Aegis as a shield against their enemies, while individuals who pursued wisdom and justice in their daily lives could feel themselves protected by the same power that had defended the gods themselves in their battles against the forces of chaos. The contradiction inherent in Athena's Aegis, that the goddess of wisdom chose to wear the face of chaos and death as her most sacred symbol, speaks to a profound truth about the nature of enlightenment itself. True wisdom is not naive or purely gentle. It understands that the world contains real evil, genuine threats, and forces that cannot be reasoned with or reformed. The wise leader must be prepared to face these dark realities directly, even at the risk of being changed by the encounter. The Medusa head on Athena's Aegis serves as a constant reminder that wisdom without power is often ineffective, while power without wisdom inevitably becomes tyrannical. By combining both elements, the strategic brilliance of the goddess with the terrible finality of the Gorgon's gaze, the Aegis represents perfect divine justice, terrible to behold, impossible to escape, but ultimately fair in its application. The craftsmanship of the Aegis itself was said to be beyond mortal comprehension. Some accounts describe it as being made from the hide of the goat, Amalthea, which had nursed the infant Zeus during his hidden childhood in Crete. If true, this would mean that Athena's armor was crafted from the same material that had protected Zeus during his most vulnerable period, creating a symbolic link between divine protection in infancy and divine authority in maturity. Other descriptions emphasize the golden tassels that fringed the Aegis, each one worth a fortune and moving with supernatural life as Athena walked or flew through the heavens. These tassels were said to create a sound like distant thunder when they moved, announcing the goddess's presence to all within hearing and serving as a warning to those who might consider opposing her will. The Aegis could be worn in different configurations depending on the situation. As a breastplate, it covered Athena's heart and vital organs, symbolizing that wisdom itself was protected by divine power. As a shield, it could be held before her to deflect both physical attacks and magical assaults, its reflective surface turning hostile magic back upon those who wielded it. In some depictions, the Aegis could even be spread like a cloak, extending Athena's protection over multiple allies simultaneously. The psychological effect of the Aegis on both friends and enemies cannot be overstated. For those fighting alongside Athena, the sight of their divine ally bearing Zeus's own symbol of authority filled them with courage and confidence. They understood that they were not merely fighting alongside a powerful goddess, but under the direct protection of the supreme ruler of the cosmos. Enemy forces, conversely, often broke and fled at the mere sight of the Aegis, understanding that they faced not just Athena's wisdom and skill, but the ultimate divine authority backed by the power to petrify any who stood against justice. The maintenance and care of such a powerful artifact required special rituals and precautions. The Aegis could not be worn casually or displayed for mere show. Its power was too great and too dangerous for frivolous use. Athena herself was said to perform purification rites before donning the Aegis, ensuring that her intentions were pure and her cause just. The Medusa head in particular required careful handling, for even in its severed state it retained its deadly power and could not be looked upon directly even by the goddess who wore it. In artistic representations, the Aegis became one of the most recognizable symbols in all of Greek art. Sculptors and painters competed to capture the terrible beauty of Medusa's head surrounded by the divine magnificence of Athena's armor. These depictions served not only as religious art, but as reminders to viewers of the awesome power that stood behind civilized order and the terrible fate that awaited those who chose chaos over justice. The influence of Athena's Aegis extended beyond its immediate military applications. Magistrates and judges would invoke its protection when making difficult decisions, understanding that true justice required both wisdom to discern the truth and courage to act upon it despite opposition. Artists and craftsmen saw in the Aegis an example of how beauty and terror could be combined to create something more powerful than either element alone. Even philosophers found meaning in its symbolism, using it as an example of how apparent contradictions could be resolved at higher levels of understanding. Which aspect of Athena's divine armor do you find most compelling, the protective power or the terrifying beauty? For me, it has to be the way the Aegis embodies the principle that true strength comes from the willingness to face dark realities without losing sight of higher principles. There's something deeply comforting about the idea of wisdom that isn't naive or helpless in the face of genuine evil. Now let us turn our attention to perhaps the most famous demonstration of Athena's wisdom in action, her contest with Poseidon for the patronage of the greatest city in the ancient world. The contest between Athena and Poseidon for the patronage of Athens stands as one of the most symbolically rich and politically significant myths in all of Greek literature. It is a story that reveals not only the character of the competing gods, but also the deepest values and aspirations of Greek civilization itself. To understand the full meaning of this divine competition, we must examine not just the events themselves, but the profound cultural choices they represent, the decision between different visions of power, prosperity, and human flourishing. The setting for this momentous contest was the Acropolis of what would become Athens, but at the time was simply a growing settlement under the wise rule of King Cecrops. The hill itself was already sacred, marked by natural springs and ancient shrines that spoke to its spiritual significance long before either god took interest in its future. The rocky outcropping rose from the Attic plain like a natural throne, commanding views in all directions and providing a defensive position that would prove crucial in the centuries to come. Cecrops himself was a fascinating figure, described in various accounts as being half man and half serpent, symbolizing the connection between earthly wisdom and divine knowledge. His dual nature made him uniquely qualified to judge between divine offerings, for he understood both the practical needs of mortal communities and the symbolic significance of divine gifts. Under his leadership, the settlement had already begun to show signs of the greatness that would eventually make Athens the center of Greek intellectual and cultural life. The growing reputation of Cecrops's city had caught the attention of two very different Olympian deities. Poseidon, god of the seas and earthquakes, looked upon the coastal location and saw tremendous potential for maritime power and commercial dominance. The settlement's proximity to the sea meant that under his patronage, it could become the center of a great naval empire, its ships carrying trade goods and military might to every corner of the Mediterranean world. Athena, goddess of wisdom and strategic warfare, saw different possibilities in the same location. Where Poseidon envisioned ships and naval battles, she saw the potential for a center of learning and culture, a place where the arts of civilization could flourish and spread their influence through intellectual rather than military conquest. The choice between these two visions would determine not only which god received the city's worship, but what kind of community the settlement would become. Zeus, wise in the ways of preventing divine conflicts that could escalate into cosmic disasters, proposed the contest that would allow both gods to demonstrate their gifts while ensuring that the final decision rested with the mortals who would have to live with the consequences. This was itself a radical concept. The idea that mortals should have a voice in choosing their divine patron, that the gods should be required to prove their worth rather than simply demanding worship through displays of raw power. The morning of the contest dawned clear and bright, with gentle winds carrying the scent of wild thyme and sage from the surrounding hills. The entire population of the settlement gathered on the Acropolis to witness this unprecedented event, their faces showing the mixture of excitement and nervousness that comes from knowing they are about to witness history being made. Children pressed close to their parents, wide-eyed at the prospect of seeing gods in person, while elders whispered prayers to whatever deities might be listening, asking for the wisdom to make the right choice. Poseidon arrived first, his approach announced by the sound of waves crashing against distant shores and the trembling of the earth beneath the spectators' feet. He strode up the sacred hill with the confidence of one accustomed to inspiring awe and fear in equal measure, his trident gleaming like captured ocean foam in the morning sunlight. His very presence seemed to bring the salt smell of deep waters and the vast power of storms barely held in check. The sea god positioned himself at the highest point of the Acropolis, where the rocky ground was hardest and most unyielding. He raised his great trident high above his head, its 3 prongs catching and reflecting the light like frozen lightning, and brought it down with tremendous force upon the stone beneath his feet. The impact sent shockwaves through the hill that could be felt miles away, and from the point where his weapon struck, water began to bubble and flow. A spring had appeared, crystal clear and apparently inexhaustible, its waters reflecting the morning sky like a mirror set in living rock. The assembled mortals gasped in amazement, for water was precious beyond gold in the Mediterranean climate, and here was an endless supply flowing directly from the sacred stone of their Acropolis. Poseidon gestured proudly toward his creation, speaking in a voice like distant thunder of the power it represented and the prosperity it promised. "Behold," the Earth-shaker declared, "I give you mastery over the sea lanes, dominion over trade routes that span the known world, and the power to build an empire that will make this city feared and respected from the pillars of Heracles to the shores of distant Colchis. This spring will never run dry, just as the sea itself is eternal and inexhaustible. Choose me as your patron, and your ships will rule the waves while your merchants count profits from every port in the civilized world." The offer was magnificent and terrible in its scope. Under Poseidon's patronage, the city would indeed become a great naval power, its triremes cutting through Mediterranean waters like sea wolves hunting their prey. The wealth of distant lands would flow into its harbors, while its military might would cow potential rivals into submission. It was a vision of empire built on maritime supremacy, of prosperity achieved through dominance of the sea lanes that connected the ancient world. But as the initial excitement faded and some of the braver citizens approached to taste this miraculous water, disappointment began to replace wonder. The spring, fed by Poseidon's connection to the vast oceans, ran salt rather than fresh. While impressive to behold and symbolically powerful in its promise of naval dominion, it could neither quench human thirst nor water the crops that sustained mortal life. It was a gift of power rather than nurture, of conquest rather than sustenance. The crowd murmured uncertainly as they contemplated this divine offering. The spring was undeniably miraculous, and the promise of maritime empire was alluring, but there was something troubling about a gift that looked like water, but could not perform water's essential functions. Was this an omen of what life under Poseidon's patronage would be like? Impressive on the surface, but somehow failing to meet the deeper needs of human community? Now Athena stepped forward, moving with the measured grace of wisdom, considering all possibilities. She wore simple robes rather than battle armor and carried no obvious symbols of power or weapons of war. Her grey eyes surveyed the assembled mortals with calm intelligence, taking in every detail of their hopes and fears, their practical needs and their higher aspirations. When she spoke, her voice was clear and confident without being boastful, carrying the authority of one who understood both divine power and mortal necessity. "My uncle offers you dominion through force," she said, acknowledging Poseidon's gift with respectful recognition while making clear that she saw its limitations. "I offer you something different: prosperity through wisdom, strength through understanding, and an empire of ideas that will outlast any fleet of warships." With these words, she knelt gracefully upon the rocky ground and pressed something small into the earth, so small that those watching had to strain to see what she had planted. Unlike Poseidon's dramatic striking of stone with supernatural force, Athena's action was gentle, almost domestic in its simplicity. She placed her hands upon the spot where she had made her planting and spoke words in the ancient tongue of divine creation, calling upon the deep powers of earth and sky to nurture what she had sown. For a moment that stretched like eternity, nothing seemed to happen. The crowd grew restless, wondering if the goddess of wisdom had somehow failed to match her uncle's impressive display. Some began to whisper that perhaps Poseidon's gift, for all its saltiness, was superior to whatever modest offering Athena might provide. Then, as they watched in growing amazement, a green shoot appeared at the spot where she knelt. The shoot grew with visible speed but not supernatural haste, thickening and rising in the way that healthy plants do when conditions are perfect for growth. It put forth branches that spread wide to catch the sunlight, leaves that shimmered with silvery green radiance in the morning breeze, and within minutes had become a fully mature tree of a type none of the watchers had ever seen before. An olive tree, its graceful trunk rising from the sacred rock as if it had always been meant to grow there. As the tree reached its full height, its branches heavy with ripe fruit, Athena rose and gestured toward her creation with the quiet pride of a master craftsman displaying perfect work. She began to explain the virtues of her gift, her voice taking on the tone of a teacher sharing precious knowledge with eager students, revealing layer after layer of benefits that her simple olive tree would provide. The fruit itself, she explained, was nutritious and flavorful, capable of sustaining human life during times of scarcity while providing pleasure during times of plenty. But more important than the olives themselves was the oil that could be pressed from them, golden, pure, and incredibly versatile in its applications. This oil would light their lamps, pushing back the darkness that had limited human activity to daylight hours. It would cook their food, adding richness and flavor, while making possible culinary techniques that would elevate eating from mere survival to artistic expression. The olive oil would anoint their bodies for athletic competitions and religious ceremonies, creating a connection between physical excellence and spiritual devotion. It would serve as medicine for the sick, healing wounds and soothing pain with its natural properties. The wood of the olive tree would provide material for tools and furniture, while its leaves could feed livestock and provide herbal remedies during harsh seasons. But beyond these practical benefits, Athena explained, the olive tree carried profound symbolic meaning. Its slow growth and long life represented the patience and persistence required for true civilization to flourish. Its ability to produce abundant fruit year after year symbolized sustainable prosperity that would benefit not just the current generation but their children and grandchildren for centuries to come. Most importantly, the olive branch would become universally recognized as a symbol of peace, representing the understanding that lasting prosperity comes through cooperation and wisdom rather than conquest and domination. "My uncle's gift speaks of empire," Athena concluded, her grey eyes reflecting depths of understanding that seemed to encompass all of human history, past and future. But empires built on force alone are like houses built on shifting sand. They rise quickly and fall just as fast. I offer you something more lasting, the foundation for a civilization that will be remembered not for the territories it conquered, but for the ideas it gave birth to, the art it created, the wisdom it preserved and passed on to future generations. The choice facing King Cecrops and his people was clear, and in many ways it represented the fundamental decision that every human community must make, whether to seek prosperity through power over others or through the development of internal excellence, whether to build greatness through conquest or through culture, whether to measure success by the fear they inspired in enemies or by the respect they earned from friends and allies. The citizens deliberated carefully, understanding that their decision would shape not only their own lives, but the destiny of generations yet unborn. They looked at Poseidon's salt spring with its promise of maritime dominance and naval wealth, then at Athena's olive tree with its offer of sustainable peace and cultural flowering. Some among them surely dreamed of ruling the waves and commanding tribute from distant lands, but the majority found themselves drawn to the goddess's vision of a different kind of greatness. When King Cecrops finally announced their decision, his words carried the weight of prophecy. "We choose Athena as our patron, and with her the path of wisdom over the path of conquest, the olive branch over the trident, peace over war." May our city become known not for the enemies it defeats, but for the friends it makes, not for the wealth it extracts from others, but for the prosperity it creates through its own efforts, not for the fear it inspires, but for the respect it earns through justice and wisdom. The consequences of this choice would echo through history. Athens, as the city came to be known in honor of its divine patron, would indeed become the center of Greek intellectual and cultural life. Its philosophers would reshape human understanding of ethics, politics, and the nature of reality itself. Its dramatists would create theatrical forms that still influence how we tell stories today. Its artists and architects would establish standards of beauty that continue to inspire creators across the world. The city's commitment to Athena's values would not make it perfect. Athens would have its share of wars, political conflicts, and moral failures. But even in its darkest moments, the ideal represented by the olive tree would continue to inspire its citizens to strive for something higher than mere dominance, something more lasting than simple victory over enemies. Poseidon, as might be expected, did not graciously accept defeat. His anger at being rejected by mortals who dared to choose wisdom over power manifested in floods and earthquakes that reminded the Athenians of the price of defying divine will. But these disasters, while destructive in the short term, ultimately served to strengthen the citizens' resolve and deepen their commitment to their chosen patron. They learned to build better, to plan more carefully, to work together more effectively in the face of natural challenges, lessons that served them well in all their future endeavors. The olive tree that Athena planted on that long-ago morning became the most sacred object in Athens, protected by laws that made its destruction a capital crime. The oil from its fruit was used only for the most important religious ceremonies, while saplings grown from its seeds spread throughout Attica and beyond, creating groves that would supply the city's needs for centuries to come. But perhaps the most lasting legacy of Athena's victory was the principle it established, that communities thrive best when they choose cooperation over competition, wisdom over force, sustainable development over short-term exploitation. The olive tree, growing slowly but surely from the rocky soil of the Acropolis, became a living symbol of these values, its roots growing deeper with each passing year, its branches reaching higher toward the light, its fruit nourishing each new generation that chose to follow the path of wisdom rather than the way of conquest. Among the 12 great Olympian deities, 3 goddesses stood apart from their divine siblings in a way that marked them as fundamentally different from both their male counterparts and their female peers. Athena, Artemis, and Hestia had each chosen, or been chosen by, a path that set them apart from the complex web of romantic entanglements, marriages, and family alliances that characterized most divine relationships. They were the Parthenos goddesses, the eternal virgins whose power derived not from their relationships with others, but from their own autonomous nature. To understand what this designation truly meant in the context of ancient Greek culture, we must look beyond our modern concepts of celibacy or sexual abstinence and examine the profound political and spiritual implications of divine autonomy in a world where power was typically defined through relationships, alliances, and the control of one deity over another. In the patriarchal structure of both Olympus and mortal society, marriage was not primarily about love or companionship, but about the creation of political bonds and the transfer of authority. When a goddess married, she typically became subject to her husband's will in matters of divine governance, her own power channeled through and limited by his authority. Even Hera, queen of the gods and powerful in her own right, found her actions constrained and her decisions subject to Zeus's ultimate approval. Her legendary jealousy and scheming were not merely personal failings, but expressions of frustration at her limited agency within the marriage structure that defined her divine role. Against this backdrop, the choice of Athena, Artemis, and Hestia to remain unmarried represented something far more radical than simple personal preference. It was a declaration of independence that allowed them to operate with a freedom and authority that their married counterparts could never fully achieve. By remaining virgins, they retained complete control over their own power and could enter into alliances or conflicts based purely on their own judgment, rather than being bound by their husband's decisions or family loyalties. Athena's virginity was particularly significant given her role as Zeus's favourite daughter and closest advisor. Had she married, her husband would have gained indirect access to the king of the gods' most private counsels and strategic thinking. Her independence meant that Zeus could confide in her completely, knowing that her loyalty was to him personally and to the principles of justice and wisdom they shared, rather than to any competing divine faction that marriage might create. The practical implications of Athena's unmarried state extended far beyond Olympian politics. As a virgin goddess, she was uniquely qualified to serve as a mentor and protector to mortal heroes without the complications that might arise from romantic or sexual interest. Heroes like Odysseus, Perseus, and Diomedes could receive her guidance without worrying about jealous divine spouses or the complex obligations that might come from romantic entanglement with a goddess. Her help was freely given based on merit and need rather than personal desire or emotional attachment. This autonomy also allowed Athena to establish a different kind of relationship with her mortal worshippers, particularly women. While goddesses like Aphrodite and Hera were associated with specific aspects of female experience, romantic love and marriage respectively, Athena offered an alternative model of feminine power that did not depend on relationships with men. Young women who felt called to intellectual pursuits, artistic creation, or other activities that might conflict with traditional marriage roles could look to Athena as proof that fulfillment was possible outside conventional domestic arrangements. The priestesses who served Athena's temples embodied this alternative path in their own lives. Many chose to remain unmarried throughout their period of service, dedicating themselves entirely to the goddess's worship and the management of her sacred sites. These women often achieved positions of significant influence within their communities, advising on matters of justice, education, and civic planning in ways that would have been impossible had they been bound by the traditional obligations of marriage and motherhood. The symbolic implications of Athena's virginity were deeply connected to her association with wisdom and strategic thinking. In Greek philosophical understanding, the pursuit of truth required a kind of intellectual purity that could be compromised by emotional attachments or personal desires. The virgin goddess represented the ideal of objective judgment, unclouded by the passions that so often distorted human reasoning and divine decision-making alike. This is not to suggest that the Greeks viewed sexual experience or romantic love as inherently corrupting. Their mythology is filled with celebrations of both. Rather, they understood that different roles required different kinds of purity, and the role of divine wisdom keeper demanded the specific purity that came from remaining unentangled in the web of desires and obligations that romantic relationships inevitably created. Athena's birth from Zeus's head rather than through conventional procreation reinforced this aspect of her nature. She was, in a sense, born of pure thought rather than physical desire, created through intellectual rather than sexual energy. This origin story established her as fundamentally different from other deities, existing in a realm of abstract principles and strategic concepts rather than the realm of physical appetites and emotional needs that governed most divine behavior. The armor and weapons that Athena carried from birth served as external symbols of her internal autonomy. Unlike goddesses whose power was expressed through beauty, fertility, or domestic authority, Athena's strength was immediately visible in the martial equipment she bore. She needed no protection from others because she was perfectly capable of protecting herself. She required no gifts or tributes from suitors because she was complete in herself. The spear, shield, and helmet announced to all observers that here was a goddess who could not be conquered, controlled, or possessed. Yet Athena's virginity was not motivated by fear or hatred of sexuality itself. Greek myths contain numerous examples of her helping mortal couples achieve happy marriages, blessing unions that were based on mutual respect and shared values rather than mere passion or political convenience. Her opposition was not to love itself, but to relationships that would compromise her own independence or dilute her ability to serve as an impartial arbiter of justice and wisdom. The goddess's relationship with handicrafts and skilled labor took on additional meaning in this context. The arts of weaving, pottery, metalworking, and other crafts were traditionally associated with women's work, but under Athena's patronage, they became something more: expressions of individual creativity and skill that could provide economic independence for those who mastered them. A woman skilled in Athena's crafts could support herself without relying on marriage for economic security, opening possibilities for life paths that would otherwise be closed. This economic dimension of Athena's influence was particularly important in ancient Greek society, where women had few legal rights and limited opportunities for independent action. The goddess's patronage of skilled crafts created a space where female excellence could be recognized and rewarded, where women could achieve status and influence through their own abilities rather than through their relationships with men. The festivals and rituals dedicated to Athena often emphasized themes of female community and mutual support rather than competition for male attention. The Panathenaea, with its focus on the creation of the peplos by groups of young women working together over months of collaborative effort, modeled an alternative to the isolation and rivalry that characterized women's experience in many other contexts. These festivals created temporary communities where women could celebrate their shared skills and support each other's achievements without the mediation of male authority. Athena's role as protector of cities extended the principle of virgin autonomy into the political realm. Cities under her patronage were encouraged to value independence and self-sufficiency over alliances based on subordination to more powerful neighbors. Just as the goddess maintained her freedom through her own strength and wisdom, the communities she protected were expected to develop their own capabilities rather than relying entirely on external support or protection. This political dimension of virgin goddess worship had practical implications for how Greek city-states approached international relations. Cities with strong Athena cults often emphasized diplomatic solutions over military conquest, strategic planning over brute force, and the development of internal resources over the exploitation of subject territories. They sought to become the kind of communities that others would want to ally with, rather than the kind that others would submit to only from fear. The educational implications of Athena's virgin status were equally significant. As a goddess who had never been subject to another's authority except her father Zeus, and even there the relationship was more collaborative than hierarchical, she represented the ideal of intellectual independence. Students who sought wisdom under her patronage were encouraged to think for themselves, to question received authorities, and to develop their own understanding through careful observation and logical reasoning. This educational philosophy stood in contrast to systems based on rote memorization of traditional teachings or unquestioning acceptance of established authorities. Athenian schools, particularly during the city's classical period, became famous throughout the Greek world for producing students who could think critically and argue persuasively, skills that proved invaluable in both democratic politics and intellectual discourse. What do you think would be more challenging in today's world? Maintaining complete personal independence or finding meaningful connection with others? For me, it has to be the balance between the two. There's wisdom in Athena's choice of autonomy, but also something beautiful about the connections that require vulnerability and compromise. Her example shows that both paths can lead to different kinds of strength and fulfillment. Now let us explore how Athena used her unique position to guide and mentor the greatest heroes of Greek mythology. Throughout the vast tapestry of Greek mythology, no deity played a more crucial or consistent role in the success of mortal heroes than grey-eyed Athena. While other gods might offer spectacular aid in single moments of crisis, lending supernatural strength for one crucial battle, or providing magical weapons for a specific quest, Athena's approach to heroic mentorship was fundamentally different and ultimately more valuable. She served as the divine embodiment of strategic thinking, the goddess who taught heroes not just how to win individual victories, but how to think like victors in every situation they might face. The relationship between Athena and her chosen heroes reveals profound truths about the nature of wisdom, courage, and the kind of divine assistance that actually helps mortals grow rather than simply solving their problems for them. Unlike gods who might use their power to overwhelm obstacles on behalf of their favorites, Athena consistently provided guidance that enhanced her heroes' own capabilities, teaching them to solve problems through intelligence and strategic planning rather than relying on divine intervention. This approach reflected Athena's deep understanding of what truly serves mortals in their development toward greatness. Heroes who succeeded primarily through borrowed divine power often found themselves helpless when that power was withdrawn or unavailable. But heroes who learned to think strategically, to analyze situations carefully, and to plan their actions with wisdom and foresight developed capabilities that served them throughout their lives and in situations far beyond the specific challenges for which they had originally sought divine help. Consider the complex relationship between Athena and Odysseus, perhaps the most famous example of her mentorship in action. From their first encounters, it was clear that what drew the goddess to the king of Ithaca was not his physical strength, for he was surpassed in that regard by many other heroes, but rather the quality of his mind. Odysseus thought like Athena herself, approaching problems as puzzles to be solved rather than obstacles to be overcome through brute force. The goddess's guidance of Odysseus throughout his epic journey home from Troy demonstrates her mentorship philosophy perfectly. When he faced the Cyclops Polyphemus, Athena did not simply strike down the monster or transport her favorite hero to safety. Instead, she inspired Odysseus to think creatively about his situation, leading him to the brilliant stratagem of blinding the Cyclops and escaping by clinging to the bellies of sheep. The victory was entirely his own, achieved through his own courage and cleverness, but enhanced by the divine wisdom that helped him see possibilities that panic might have obscured. Similarly, when Odysseus encountered the sirens, whose irresistible song lured sailors to their deaths on rocky shores, Athena's assistance came not in the form of magical protection, but through inspiration that allowed Odysseus to devise a solution that satisfied both his curiosity and his need for survival. By having himself bound to the mast while his crew stopped their ears with wax, he became the first mortal to hear the siren's song and live to tell of it, a victory of strategic thinking over both supernatural danger and human weakness. This pattern of guidance through inspiration rather than direct intervention characterized all of Athena's relationships with heroes. She understood that the greatest gift she could give them was not temporary supernatural power, but permanent enhancement of their own natural abilities. Her heroes became better versions of themselves rather than merely dependent recipients of divine favor. The goddess's mentorship of Perseus provides another excellent example of this philosophy in action. When the young hero accepted the seemingly impossible task of slaying Medusa, Athena could have simply killed the Gorgon herself. The goddess certainly possessed the power to do so. Instead, she provided Perseus with the tools and knowledge he needed to accomplish the task himself, the polished bronze shield that would allow him to see Medusa's reflection without being turned to stone, guidance on how to approach the monster while she slept, and the strategic wisdom to strike quickly and decisively when the moment came. But even more importantly, Athena taught Perseus to think like a hero. She showed him how to analyze seemingly impossible challenges and break them down into manageable components. The task of slaying Medusa seemed impossible only if approached directly, but when examined strategically, it revealed weaknesses that could be exploited by a clever and prepared hero. This lesson in strategic analysis served Perseus well throughout his subsequent adventures, allowing him to succeed in challenges that would have defeated heroes who relied solely on strength or courage. The relationship between Athena and Heracles presents a particularly interesting case study in divine mentorship because Heracles was fundamentally different from heroes like Odysseus and Perseus. Where they succeeded primarily through intelligence and strategic thinking, Heracles was renowned for his incredible physical strength and his straightforward approach to problem-solving. Yet even with this very different type of hero, Athena's guidance proved invaluable. During Heracles' famous 12 labors, Athena appeared at crucial moments to provide not additional strength, for the hero already possessed more than enough of that, but strategic insight that allowed him to use his strength more effectively. When he faced the Nemean lion, whose golden hide could not be pierced by any weapon, it was Athena who suggested using the lion's own claws to skin it after he had strangled the beast. When he confronted the Hydra, whose heads multiplied whenever one was cut off, Athena's guidance led him to the strategy of cauterizing each neck stump to prevent regeneration. These interventions were subtle but crucial, representing the difference between mere strength and intelligent application of strength. Without Athena's strategic wisdom, Heracles might have spent eternity trying to pierce the Nemean lion's hide with conventional weapons or battling an ever-increasing number of Hydra heads. With her guidance, he learned to think creatively about his challenges and find solutions that used his natural gifts more effectively. The goddess's mentorship of Diomedes during the Trojan War provides perhaps the most dramatic example of how divine wisdom could enhance mortal capabilities without overwhelming them. When Athena granted Diomedes the ability to distinguish gods from mortals on the battlefield, she gave him knowledge rather than power. The strength to wound Ares and Aphrodite came from Diomedes himself, enhanced but not replaced by divine favor. More importantly, Athena taught him to recognize when divine intervention was appropriate and when it was not. Wisdom that kept him from the hubris that destroyed other heroes who received similar divine attention. This educational dimension of Athena's mentorship extended beyond individual heroes to entire communities that sought her guidance. The city of Athens itself can be seen as her greatest student, a mortal community that learned to embody her values and apply her strategic principles to the challenges of civic life. Under her influence, Athenian democracy developed institutions that emphasized careful deliberation, strategic planning, and the application of collective wisdom to complex social problems. The schools and academies that flourished in Athens during its classical period reflected Athena's approach to education, not the passive absorption of information, but the active development of critical thinking skills. Students were taught not just what to think, but how to think, not just facts, but methods for discovering and evaluating facts. This educational philosophy produced generations of citizens capable of self-governance and intellectual innovation that influenced the entire ancient world. Athena's heroes shared certain characteristics that reveal what the goddess valued most in mortal partners. They were typically intelligent rather than merely strong, curious rather than simply obedient, and willing to take responsibility for their own actions rather than blaming fate or the gods for their failures. They approached challenges with careful observation and strategic planning, but they also possessed the courage to act decisively when action was required. Perhaps most importantly, Athena's heroes typically used their victories in service of something greater than personal glory. Odysseus fought to return home to his family and kingdom. Perseus used his success to protect his mother and establish a dynasty dedicated to justice. Heracles completed his labors to achieve redemption and ultimately apotheosis. Even Diomedes, when granted the power to wound gods, used it not for personal aggrandizement but in service of the Greek cause in the Trojan War. This pattern suggests that Athena chose her heroes not just for their potential for success, but for their potential to use success wisely. She invested her divine guidance in mortals who would use their enhanced capabilities to benefit others, creating a positive feedback loop that strengthened both human civilization and divine influence in the world. The techniques Athena used to provide guidance were as varied as the heroes she helped and the challenges they faced. Sometimes her aid was direct and visible, as when she appeared to Odysseus in her own form to provide crucial advice at moments of crisis. More often, her assistance was subtle and could be attributed to coincidence or luck by those who did not understand its true source. A favorable wind at just the right moment, a crucial piece of information overheard at exactly the right time, or the sudden clarity of thought that allowed a hero to see the solution to a problem that had previously seemed insurmountable. This subtlety was itself a form of wisdom, for it allowed mortals to maintain their sense of agency and accomplishment while still receiving divine guidance when they needed it most. Heroes who succeeded with Athena's help could legitimately take pride in their victories, knowing that while they had received divine guidance, the courage, effort, and skill required for success had been their own. The goddess also served as a bridge between different types of knowledge, divine and mortal, theoretical and practical, ancient and innovative. Her heroes often found themselves in possession of information they could not have discovered through ordinary means, but this information was always presented in ways that enhanced, rather than replaced, their own reasoning abilities. She taught them to synthesize different sources of knowledge and to apply abstract principles to concrete situations. The legacy of Athena's approach to heroic mentorship extended far beyond the specific heroes she guided. The stories of her interventions became templates that mortals could use to understand how divine assistance actually works, not as a replacement for human effort and responsibility, but as an enhancement of human capabilities when they are directed toward just and noble purposes. These stories taught that the gods help those who help themselves, but they particularly favor those who combine personal courage with wisdom, individual ambition with concern for others, and strength with strategic intelligence. In our own time, when we face challenges that seem overwhelming and solutions that appear impossibly complex, Athena's example as a mentor provides valuable guidance. She reminds us that the most effective help often comes not from someone else solving our problems for us, but from guidance that helps us develop our own problem-solving capabilities. True mentorship enhances rather than replaces our own abilities, teaching us to think more clearly, plan more strategically, and act more courageously in pursuit of goals that benefit not just ourselves, but the communities we serve. The grey-eyed goddess shows us that wisdom is not a passive quality, but an active force that must be applied to real-world challenges to achieve its full potential. Her heroes succeeded not because they were perfect, but because they learned to combine courage with intelligence, strength with strategy, and personal ambition with service to higher principles. In doing so, they became examples for all mortals who aspire to greatness, not just for its own sake, but for the good it can accomplish in the world. And now, as the stars wheel overhead in their ancient patterns and the night deepens around us, it is time to bring our long journey through Athena's realm to its peaceful conclusion. We have walked the marble halls of Olympus and witnessed the miraculous birth of wisdom from divine thought. We have explored the terrible beauty of the Aegis and understood the symbolic power of the Gorgon's head. We have stood with the citizens of ancient Athens as they chose the olive tree over the salt spring, wisdom over conquest, sustainable prosperity over imperial dominance. We have contemplated the radical autonomy of the virgin goddess, understanding how her independence allowed her to serve as an impartial guide and mentor to mortals seeking justice and truth. And we have seen how her unique approach to heroic mentorship guidance that enhanced rather than replaced mortal capabilities, created legends that continue to inspire us with examples of intelligence triumphant over brute force, strategy victorious over chaos, and wisdom applied in service of the greater good. As you drift towards sleep, carry with you the image of those grey eyes that saw clearly through confusion and complexity to the truth that lay beneath. Remember the olive tree growing from rocky soil, its roots deepening year by year, its branches reaching toward the light, its fruit nourishing generation after generation who chose the path of wisdom over the way of conquest. Let Athena's example remind you that true strength comes not from overwhelming others, but from understanding yourself and your world clearly enough to act wisely and courageously when action is needed. May her strategic wisdom guide your thoughts as you navigate tomorrow's challenges, and may her commitment to justice inspire your own choices as you work to build communities worthy of the olive branch rather than empires built on the sword. Sleep well, and may your dreams be filled with the kind of clarity that comes when wisdom and courage walk hand in hand through the complexities of an uncertain world. In the realm of sleep, perhaps you too might glimpse the grey-eyed goddess standing ready to guide all who seek truth over illusion, understanding over ignorance, and the lasting victories that come from building rather than destroying. Good night, fellow seekers of wisdom. Rest now in the knowledge that the greatest adventures are those that lead us not to distant lands, but to deeper understanding of ourselves and our world, and that the most precious treasures are not gold or jewels, but the insights that help us live with greater wisdom, courage, and compassion for all who share this ancient, beautiful, and eternally challenging journey we call life.